Hi, everyone. Today I'm joined by Tim Freke. Tim is a philosopher and author of many books, 35 or in counting, which have now been translated into multiple languages. Tim is a founder of the International Community of Unividuals, which we might talk a little bit about, and is also has done some really cool YouTube series called "What Is Life," where he's talked to many names of people that folks in the audience will be familiar with, including the likes of Greg Enriquez, John Vervaeke, David Fuller, Forrest Landry, Matt Segal, Steve McIntosh, Ken Wilber, Zach Stein, Alexander Bard, etc. Sort of a who's who of the metamodern kind of discourse space for sure, as well as other folks, of course. And it was sort of like, this is someone I've got to talk to. And then most recently, I got a copy of Tim's book, Soul Story, which presents a notion of emergent spirituality. And so there's a lot of stuff that Tim and I have to get into. And I could see us going in many directions, but I will try to direct the thread of this conversation more or less coherently to keep it on the rails because, yeah, there's so much richness here. But before we get to any of that, thank you, Tim, so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, it's a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I've been aware of you and your work for a little bit. Sort of, I'll see videos here or there. People will post things you've made, or I don't know if you've made or the organization that you work with. But I saw this really cool YouTube video that got put out with some really nice production quality that seemed to be talking about the evolution of the universe leading towards a kind of emergent potential, this sort of a thing. And it was sort of like, oh yeah, this is good stuff. So I kind of knew that at some point we'd probably talk. But then, as I said, I recently got this book of yours, which was published in 2017, Soul Story, Evolution and the Purpose of Life. And man, oh man, what a book. I don't even know how to, put it. It's hard to summarize. I'll set you up for in a second to try to just talk a little bit about what you cover here. But those who will be familiar with my work around emergentism, I mean, this is in many ways another take on that same subject matter of this story of cosmic evolution leading to the development of emergent levels, deepening consciousness, and ultimately the evolution of God and the different ways that has been playing out through time and the way that meaning and purpose fit into this cosmic story, all while tackling head on the let's say, the tensions that have existed between these sorts of ideas and modern science, and trying to integrate science and religion in meaningful ways. So that's in some ways what this book does, and would love to talk a little bit about that. So why don't we start there? Talk a little bit about this book and what you get into, what you're trying to cover with it. And then maybe we can talk a little bit after that about maybe, this came out in 2017, where your thoughts have gone since the publication of this book. But yeah, talk a little bit about this book, Soul Story.
So, Soul Story essentially came from one simple idea, like things that interest me often do, Brendan, which was what if everything that has any form whatsoever is part of one process of emergence? And having spent my whole life exploring spirituality and spiritual experiences, especially as well as spiritual philosophy, what if the domain of existence that spirituality deals with, that I take very seriously, is not supernatural, but is actually an emergent level of the natural? Because there is no supernatural, but instead of naturalism covering the evolution of the universe up to biology and then this funny psyche soul thing, which is a byproduct, rather than that, of going, well, yeah, what if the evolution of the psyche or the soul is another level of reality, just like the spiritual traditions have always claimed, but rather than a pre-existent level of reality that we've fallen from, what if it's simply the most emergent level of this 14 billion year process? And is there a way we can understand things which are central to spirituality, like the survival of death, and the existence of God, a greater being, let's say, a benevolent, loving, great mind, the big mind? What if that's not something outside of the universe, but the most emergent level of the universe. So that's what I set out to do. So it was like, can I make sense of that? And it seemed a tall order when I started. But the more I worked on it, and all these years since it, the more it's made sense to me, and the better the ideas seem to be. And so it's the attraction of that simplicity and then how it plays out. And that, of course, has the effect of uniting spirituality and science, because it's all one process of emergence. And physics is looking at the foundational level, and spirituality is looking at the most emergent levels. And perhaps most importantly, or as importantly for me, it's a vision of hope. And my experiences of what I think of as deep awake states or spiritual experiences generally, especially of that greater being experience, it is intense hope, and like a redemption of all the suffering of existence, especially around death. And so it returns that, and it feels like what we've had for this last period in the intellectual mainstream, obviously not generally, but in the intellectual mainstream, we've lost that, and it's a big loss. But the intuition I'm following is that will come back, and it'll come back because it's too big a loss. It'll come back because it deals with the nature of reality. It's not just an illusion. It's not just a side effect of biology, but and I suspect this is what you will relate to in it, because it sounds like you're doing the same thing, which is, but it will come back, spirituality will come back different. It will come back as a post-scientific spirituality. And that's what has to happen.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And yeah, I mean, so this podcast is called Metamodern Spirituality. Metamodernism, gesturing towards something postmodern. So something that also takes seriously the insights of modernity as well as postmodernity, as well as the pre-modern and the traditional religious traditions that had meaningful spiritual insights. So somehow trying to bring those things together and carry them forward into a more synthetic and inclusive and integrated perspective is kind of the orientation here. I tend to lean a lot into the, then trying to really grapple with what really folding in that modern scientific insight looks like in a big way.
Yeah.
And so that for me, the discovery of emergentism, sort of small e as a concept, right? And complexity science and this notion of complexification, cosmic evolution. You mentioned Ken Wilber in the book, and you've interviewed him, but finding integral theory was also very influential in that regard. And through some of that work of, Wilber's in the 90s and following the various kind of bibliographic trail that he left into all sorts of very important figures like Ilya Prigogine and Eric Chazon and these sorts of people. There's a vision there that sort of a story that demands to be told, a soul story, and your book does it incredibly well. And I was thinking when I was reading it that I'm like, it's so lucid, it's so accessible, the language is so clear, that it makes a wonderful thing to be able to share with people, to get across some of these ideas that otherwise, and I'm very guilty of this, can end up in the realm of jargon and complexity and what's a dissipative structure and far from equilibrium thermodynamics and stuff like that. And I actually, the thought that occurred to me of referring, maybe not to you, but to whoever the author of this book is specifically, as sort of a Rob Bell of evolutionary spirituality. There's something of that nature to this work. So a couple of things now. So that's a great setup. And hopefully, if people were on the fence at all after all this, they can be like, that really sounds like something I should check out. So we won't just rehash the entire book, but I would love to dive into some specific things. And there's a couple angles there. One is this came out in 2017, and I know that some of your thought has itself evolved since then. In fact, one of the impetuses for wanting to speak with you now as opposed to some other time was that you recently put out a video in which you talked a little bit about your shifting conception of consciousness and whether or not it is indeed primary. And I thought, that would be a very interesting thing that I wanted to talk to you about. So I want to get to that. And maybe that's where we can start, actually, because maybe a couple other things will stem from that. So I'll set that up this way then. Yeah. So in this book, you do kind of take more of that integral, you could call it a panpsychist approach of appreciating that subjectivity goes all the way down. And it sounds like recently you have a different view on that matter. So speak to maybe your own evolution of thought around that concept.
So I think I'd almost made the complete transition in Soul Story, away from where I'd been, which was in a much more traditional idea. Everything exists in consciousness. I've been teaching that. I've written, I mean, I've written all these books saying it, it's like, and traveled around the world teaching it. And suddenly it looked like it wasn't right. And I had to negotiate that. And it came from Soul Story, because in Soul Story, I have this relational philosophy, which is really becomes stronger and stronger, which is like everything is relationship. And that goes right the way down. Everything's one thing in relationship with itself, as all these different systems. And each system is reading in its own unique way the universe. And that reading of the universe is what will become what we think of as subjectivity. So you could say subjectivity goes all the way down, but I don't think it makes any sense to call that anything like consciousness, and it's very misleading. And the view which I really started to question was the common, especially Eastern mystical idea that there is a thing called consciousness, that everything exists within. And the approach to it, the theory that I started to develop that was working for me was, I work primarily, I think, kind of phenomenologically. I look at my experience for a long, long time and what I see is I'm a system, a human being. System sounds so mechanical, but a human being, still a system, and taking in all this information. And I know that I'm taking in the vast majority of it unconsciously, because, I wasn't aware of my left foot. Oh, but I am now. And why am I aware of it now, and probably you are and anyone listening to it, and wasn't before, is because I put my attention on it. And so what seems obvious to me now is that what we call consciousness is a way of processing the information I'm taking in, and indeed the information within the system itself. So that what it looks to me like is that consciousness has evolved as a kind of a high definition processing. So everything is, every system, right down to the simplest one, let alone a life system like the plants behind me, and is in some way reacting or interacting with its environment. Once you get life, suddenly the amount of information that's being taken in, it becomes enormous with the development of the senses. And also with life, some of that information really matters and most of it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And the stuff that really matters is a matter of life and death or continuation or all the things that make a biological species maintain itself, that matters. The vast majority of its background. And that what it looks like has developed is that ability to read the environment has developed so that you can focus and read in high definition the stuff that matters, including the stuff that matters in yourself. And this is it. This is what it's like when it does that. Now so there you're going, look, so the experience, the conscious experience that I'm having is a very highly emergent level of the relationality which defines the whole universe all the way down. That's quite different to the idea that there is a thing or a presence or I don't even know what they called consciousness, which is what I would have said. And that somehow the ground is already conscious. I don't know what of or how it's conscious of itself, but what would that mean? How is it conscious? None of those things are answered. And it's fundamentally, well, there's two things I want to say, really. I want to say it's fundamentally what I now regard as a mythic understanding. And what I see, that I want to just divert into this, and then hopefully it's relevant.
Yeah, take your time.
Is what this isn't Soul Story, this is since Soul Story, but what I see is there are two types of anachronistic thinking which define the two things that I'm kind of in the opposition to. One is reductionist science. And the problem with reductionist science is it takes language which is appropriate to the foundational levels of reality, mathematics, for instance, the best language by far. And then it deals with human experiences with the same language. It was really just particles and mathematics and we can understand. And it's like, no, at this level of emergence, you need other things because it's become about love and beauty and music and all this stuff. And that language is not good enough. And then what I see with mythic thinking is it's the opposite way around. So it takes language which is appropriate to the human level and applies it to the very, very foundational level. So consciousness, that's not going to come for a while. That's anachronistic. Nearly always what comes with it is intentionality. There's consciousness and it wants to know itself. What's that? Where's that intentionality come from? Or it wants to love itself, or some mythic quality to get this. And that's the involution or the overflowing or the emanation and all of that stuff, which I was very attracted to, but now feel it really doesn't work. And I think it's perfectly natural that human beings did that, because human beings developed a language for the human level. They didn't develop it to understand physics for a long time. But now we have, and now we need to stop using that language for the lower levels. And then the last thing, which I can get into if you like to, is I looked at my arguments for why I believed that everything existed in consciousness, and I was shocked to see that I'd completely missed a complete fallacy, which is now obvious to me again, but for most of my life was not obvious. And if you want me to go through that, I'll happily outline.
Why don't we'll do them both at the same time? So yeah, how would you describe what that fallacy is?
Okay, so this is something you'll hear repeated again and again in people who do similar things that I've done, but I'll deal with myself, so that's easier to criticize me. This is the way I do it in one of my best books called Lucid Living. I love that book. It's such a great book. It's another real bang short book, and it kind of nails, I think, this perennialist way of seeing things. And I think I nailed it so well I saw what was wrong with it, which is a real shame because it was such a lovely book. And the argument I'll use there is a very common one, a phenomenological one, which is, look, let me do it really short. Everything you're experiencing is a sensation in consciousness. That's your actual experience. Your actual experience is everything exists in consciousness. Just look. Everything is that's the argument. And it's like, you get it and you can see it like that. I can do it now. And it's like, ooh. But of course, what seems obvious now is the answer is in the question. Because you're going, have you ever experienced anything which wasn't a sensation in consciousness? Or a thought in consciousness? But what you've done in the question is you've gone, first, there's a thing. Maybe you've just said there is what you're experiencing sensations in consciousness, or am I experiencing my room and the computer and looking at you? And that's not in consciousness. In fact, there is no, that's a reification. It's making a thing out of a verb.
Yeah.
Which is that I am conscious of you and of the room. And what that left me with was, look, you can't argue from experience for anything, because the way in which you ideate will in part create what you experience. So it's self-validating. Mm. If you think in that way, you will experience it that way. But if you think in a different way, or you ideate in a different way, you'll experience it in a different way. So that whole approach just collapsed for me, and left me free to enter new territory.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so there's a lot here. So just a couple things, just so they don't get lost. But yeah, you mentioned that bringing to attention and the information that matters versus all that other stuff that's sort of background. And I think that insight is very key. It's very important for actually really appreciating what meaning is all about. I just published a book called, it's on the evolution of meaning, and it's the first volume, called A Universal Learning Process. But I'm really trying to grapple with, what do we mean by meaning? And if we're talking about the evolution of meaning, and you covered this a little bit in your talk about the evolution of these, what do you call them? There's certain kinds of stories that human beings that at the cultural level that we generate. How do these evolve, and how does the kind of meaning and purpose itself evolve? I think that it becomes very important to be able to appreciate that there is this sort of attentional filtration process, and there's a fundamental dynamic about filtering out that kind of superfluous non-meaningful information and this honing of attention to meaningful information, which is crucial for the whole cosmic evolutionary process to then lead to consciousness, actually, as a kind of integration of that kind of information through various sensory inputs and whatnot to appreciate this. But so I just wanted to say that because it, when I hear those sorts of things, it resonates. But everything you're saying really resonates. I mean, I'd be basically in total agreement with all that. But maybe rather than dig into the specific arguments, and we can come back to that, I think one of the things out of the gate I want to speak to is that some people hearing this might say, what a lot of people say when something really important to them feels like it's kind of coming under critique or attack, and there's this is part of what meaning-making structures and meaningful worldviews do, is they try to immunize themselves against various forms of, being blown up, which is generally a good thing. But people might hear this and be like, no, I don't like that. And there's, and often because there's a sense that if it's not that, then we're back in this reductionistic, meaningless cosmos.
Exactly right, Brendan.
So talk a little bit about how you feel this new way of looking at things is actually very helpful or freeing, or I don't know, some of that aspect of this.
Yeah, I'm so pleased you did that. One of the comments I get most of the time was, "Oh, Tim's become a materialist." And I'm like, no.
Yep.
There's not just two options. It's not just idealism or materialism. Which one?
Right.
It's like there are other options, and this one is going, look. It looks like the universe, the present understanding we have through physics of the universe it's informational. Mathematics is the language we need to understand it. When I talk about it being the one now, I mean what we mean by the number one. I don't mean a surrogate. It's really God, but we're going to call it the one, or it's conscious. It's the one, but it's conscious. And it's like, no, I mean what we mean by the number one, the undifferentiated. Something undifferentiated that can be differentiated in any way is differentiated in this way. And it's evolving. That information is evolving into these ever more complex systems, where a system just means an organized whole, and including you and me. And in doing that, it's reached not just life, which is amazing enough, but it's reached the psyche or the soul. I mean, just for people that may not know this, the word soul is just comes from a Germanic root. The same word in Greek is psyche. These are the same thing. And what they're talking about, I like to define experientially, that they're talking about the experience that you're having and I'm having right now, and everyone listening to this is having, of a non-material level of reality. That's the way we experience it, full of images. And if you go off into that in dreams, the whole worlds are there. And if you start studying it through shamanic practices, say, or ayahuasca or psychedelics, or just meditation, there is a universe out there. And that's the claim that spiritual traditions have made right from the beginning, which is, that thing you're experiencing, we have this modern idea that it's just a byproduct of the brain, because it's clearly linked to the biology. But the reason it's linked to the biology, I think, is that's what it has evolved from. But every level is more than. That's the whole point of emergentism. It's more than and cannot be reduced to the lesser. So we're experiencing this domain, and the thing I'm exploring is, and that is a significant domain, that the psyche has evolved to survive the death of the body, and that there's ways of understanding that which are not woo-woo, and that psyches have combined into like a super system, into a super psyche, and that's what we experience traditionally by as God.
Yeah.
Not something which is at the beginning, but something which is the universe is flowering into. Perhaps the easiest way for people to get it is, you think of it, you get a lot of computers together and you plug them all in together, you get a supercomputer. Or my body, that's the other analogy for me, which is, it's happened, as you know, throughout the whole of the evolutionary process. But this is a big one, whereby most of life was just single cells. And then somehow trillions of them have become Tim. And now they form a super system. And that, I think, is happening on the next level up.
Yeah.
And we touch into that. And when we do, it's utterly amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree. That intuition strikes me as, I don't know, that's what sings in my soul when I come to these issues. And I've spent a lot of my life exploring the various religions and the different ways of conceptualizing these things, and then being able to find the language of emergence and complexity to be able to articulate some of these dynamics in a way that remains true in the most important ways to the kinds of things that we might be gesturing to when we use a word like God, but also is able to bring in some really crucial semantic or conceptual clarifications about how that works and why, has been, very revolutionary in my thought for all this. And I think that there's something very profound about that totally reorients one's perspective, is rather than looking to God or the sacred or the divine or spirit as being the, primary originary source and genesis of all things that in some senses we return to. And there's a degree of truth to that, right? But to conceptualize it, rather as this emergent phenomena that successive levels of cosmic evolution have been essentially accreting and towards, you could say. But it does raise new kinds of, you could almost call them theological questions for sure. Certainly kinds of new metaphysical questions. But gosh, so you did bring up the area in this book anyway that I would love to dive into briefly. Because that's the survival of death, and I feel like it's naturally kind of the place where this leads. So I think that's as good a tee up to this as any. And so I'll just say from my experience of reading this book, like the whole first half is like, oh yeah, this is so wonderfully a clear, lucid articulation of basically this emergentist spirituality, that it's like yes, 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 yes. Then you get to the how do you say imagnos? Which is, you try to make this point that what we are doing as sort of souls is operating in a sense at kind of an immaterial sphere, and you do this really interesting pivot that I want to focus on, because that's where I was sort of like, I want to get conceptually clear.
That's definitely the moment. That is
because then then the last third of the book, I'm like, oh yeah, I love all this, but it's like how you. So anyway, it's hard to summarize, obviously, but there's something like this, and please, feel free to fill in all the details, correct this, and also maybe add new stuff as you've been thinking about it. But like, you suggest that emergent levels, I use matter, life, mind, and culture from Enriquez's model. And when we get to this culture thing, we are these psyches, right? And so what's happening in my mind with my thoughts and my ideas and my imaginations and all this stuff is not really reducible, obviously, to my biological substrate. It is dependent upon it, arguably, but this is kind of the thing I want to probe. So then there's this other thing out there, and you kind of seem to make the case that, okay, then there's that. And what that allows us then is this sort of new substrate, you could say, in which the divine, in a sense, sort of takes root. And so my question is sort of like, how do you avoid, though, the fact that if things are emergent, they do seem to, even though they're not reducible to, they seem to rely on what exists before it, right? Like I'm an animal, but that's dependent upon me also being a living organism. And like, you can't take away my matter without also destroying my life, exactly that sort of thing, right? So it's not like just once we get life, we can kind of detach life from matter. And similarly, I don't see how we can kind of detach psyche from biology. So how is it that when we die, it's not all gone? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yes, and that's the biggie right there. So this is an area I've been doing a lot of work on since, to try and clarify what I'm trying to explore, and to push it as hard as I can, Brendan, to see if it just collapses. So, but to explain this, I have to bring in some other ideas. I'm going to try and do it as briefly as I can. They're ideas in Soul Story. So there's the idea that that what has formed, this is a process of forming, but what has formed hasn't gone anywhere. The past doesn't pass, it accumulates. So the information accumulates, and it's not passive. It's actually forming the algorithms, if you like. So it can be imagined as like an expanding hard disk of which it's like Bohm's implicit universe, or implicate universe, he calls it. And then this, which is being run by it. So the reason I talk like this is because of my past. The reason I move my hands is because of my past. The reason I'm in this room and not your room is because of my past. The reason we're talking is because you set up this conversation and blah, blah, blah. All of the past is present, going right the way back. So that the universe has behind it what I started calling an infoverse, which is governing all of these systems. So then when you're meeting me, you're not meeting this kind of like slice of now as if that was possible. What you're meeting is a process, because everything is one process. And so Tim is his past. Tim is a system in relationship with the universe. That's what Tim is. And well, the universe as Tim in relationship to the universe, if we're being really accurate. And I'm made of my past, and that governs what I am. So what I want to try and say is, look, that's identity. And what the biological level does is it organizes matter in certain ways. So one of the things, famously, I don't know the exact thing, people say different things, but every cell in your body changes after 10 years, every atom changes after 10 years. So clearly, I'm not that matter. Mm-hmm. I'm the system which is organizing that, and matter is passing through me all the time. But that's what the system does. And when the system can't do that, it will fail. And then that will be the end of the system. And that's what we call death. But the system is also evolved onto this transmaterial level, which is imaginal. So part of the system, the bit we call the psyche, is dealing with imaginal information, which is what we experience it to be. Now, it's evolved from it, and the two are obviously linked, but they're not reducible, they're not the same. So I think of the psyche as a sense. So it seems to me that everything we experience, we are sensing. So there's the many senses, the 5, but there's more than that, isn't there? But with the way in which we sense, and they're all very different. You can't see music, and you can't touch it, but you can hear it, and so forth. And then there's what I think of as the psi sense, which is the thing which has also evolved, which allows us to sense. Well, I think we can sense quite a bit with it, but let's just stick with the imaginal. Because one of the things which intrigues me, just as an aside we can come back to, is if we're having spiritual experiences, how? How can you experience the oneness? You can't sense it. Mm-hmm. How can you experience with the ordinary senses? How do you experience God? You can't sense it with your ordinary senses. How do you know all these things? How can you experience shamanic states and psychedelic visions, all the rest of it? So what I'm suggesting is, look, we've developed these senses, which we read this information, and we've developed a psi sense, which we can read our own processing and the soul domain generally. So then what I'm saying, in essence, is you're a system which can do both those things. Part of the system fails, but the rest of the system can still do what it's meant to do. It can continue. It'd be like we're on Zoom right now. But if suddenly the sound went, and you wouldn't go, that's impossible. It's impossible. How can the sound go and yet I see you? They come together. They work together. Can't you see? You go, oh, the sound bit has failed on the program, but the visual's still working. And you wouldn't go, well, look, sound developed first. We had telephones way before we had cameras. How can that go? It's impossible. You just go, it's not impossible. That part of the system failed and the other bit carried on. And so what I'm positing for the survival of the soul, which I think explains all of the evidence we have, like the huge number of near-death experiences, is that the experience of imagination continues. Because what you are is a passivity system. That's what you are. And it's organizing material things, and it can't do that anymore. So that will fail. You won't be able to see, you won't be able to touch, you won't be able to do all that stuff. But this can still function. So the system, not some part of you, not some other thing, but you, as a system, including everything that's ever happened to you, just carry on. But now you're only experiencing this. And because of the thing we talked about earlier, that wherever you put attention becomes vivid, it becomes incredibly vivid. Just like, when you're awake, your imagination for most of us is not particularly vivid. When you're asleep at night, you can have a dream. It's so vivid, you think it's more real than real. And if you go into these, if you explore spiritual experiences, you'll know, anyone who's done that will know that those are very vivid. So it's when you put attention on it. So that's what I'm basically going. One system, bit of it fails, the other bit carries on.
Okay, so this is really interesting, and a couple things to bring up here. And by the way, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but I think it's important for folks being familiar with you and your work is that you talk about having an awakening experience when you were 12 years old, and so I just wanted to throw that in there because you since then you've been very interested, obviously, in these phenomena, and you've studied and you've written books on these sorts of things. But you're not. There's a deep phenomenological practice, you could say, here as well. And so this isn't just.
It's the most important thing.
Yeah. Right. So
the experience is the most important thing, and I lead people in the experience. That's what I do. That's what I travel the world doing. Yeah. So that's central. Yeah. The philosophy is there to support all of that.
Right. So anyway, I just wanted to that was sort of a programming note because I think it's important. But okay, so then this. So without getting into the weeds, but this is so fascinating. And I think this presentation of these ideas actually struck me as rather novel. Like I hadn't encountered a particular framing of these things in this way, but it's the sort of framing I think we need if we're going to, successfully integrate these true insights. And so, but then it does, the devil's in the details and how we make sense of it. And so,
absolutely.
So one of the things that stood out to me, and at first I thought, well, this could just be, superfluous, but I'm thinking it might be more important. So I'll voice it here is that you talk about matter, life, and soul. I tend to, as I say, use the unified theory of knowledge complexification map. When you've talked to Greg Enriquez, and you're probably familiar with that to some degree of matter, life, mind, and culture. And I find Greg's presentation of that very wonderful, does a great job of explaining why these new emergent levels of complexity show up and the different information processing systems that sort of ground them. So that's the framework I'm working in. And I think maybe some of my confusion might be coming because, when I'm trying to match up your matter, life, soul with my matter, life, mind, and culture, it's the soul and how these things may or may not ultimately relate that might be what needs to be unpacked a bit. So in the UTalk frame, you get matter to life, and I think all that we'd agree with. But then Greg talks about mind, which is animals and the neuronal structure that you get with mobile animals that shows up, Precambrian explosion and all that. So it's just a new behavioral level of complexity, but it's emergent and it's processing now neuronal information. And then on top of that, you add culture, which is where language shows up. And now we've got linguistic or symbolic information that's being processed. And that accounts for the human egoic psyche in that sense, right? So I think that all that mapping does a really good job to try to account for the differences of these different emergent levels. So then part of, I think, where my confusion then is like, okay, well, mind and culture, which is what human beings are experienced with their subjective phenomenal state, which is my nervous system, and on top of that, and the information that's processing, and on top of that, my linguistically mediated psyche that's processing symbolic information. But then using all of that, I don't know how we get a kind of imaginal space that then exists after the loss of the neuronal substrate, if that makes sense, right? And so I'm wondering if there's something about your conception of soul that's doing some work there that would need to be filled into the picture. I'll start with that, but is there any way maybe you could unpack from that?
Yeah. So that's the issue for me with many of the models, which are really good and interesting, is that what I'm interested in is how that, either you dismiss it and you just go, well, the soul doesn't survive death. That's why, we just need to understand it's an emergent process and that's all spiritual mumbo jumbo. My experience of working with people who are dying and being around death a lot personally has left me with the profound, an intuition, let's call it, and especially all the huge amount of near-death experiences. If that was on any other subject, it would be very much taken seriously. If that was an illness, we'd be focusing on it. So what is that? And my first intuition with things generally is, well, take it on face value first. And if that doesn't work, then find another explanation. So people come back and go, yeah, no, you don't understand. There's a whole domain. And I've been and had those type of experiences in different ways, not a near-death experience. And it's like, yeah, I know what you mean. And when they talk about the light, it's like, well, I've experienced that. And the love. And so it's, okay, so maybe they're saying something. And we experience, again, it's phenomenological. I am experiencing two types of experience fundamentally, of the biological world and of the imaginal. And it's a bit like the imaginal. I experience generally what's close up to me. So I experience myself, which is also what I experience with the senses. But just as the senses have evolved to really show me much more than just myself, so I think the psi sense has evolved to show me much more than just myself. And that we're able to sense each other. I think we're doing it right now. I suspect we're doing it all the time. And I think you can start to be aware of the thing which is what I call the imaginals, which really means just a realm of imagination. It's giving a name to what in Tibet is called the bardos, or, you know, in the Kogi in India, in Colombia is the Luna, or the Duat of the ancient Egyptians. It's that. And it's going, what if that's evolved? Now, the way it's evolved, the way the psyche has evolved, I suspect is similar to what Greg is saying. That people think of the senses, I think, in a very naive way often. I think I did for years, where it's just like, well, you just see things. Instead of going, yeah, but all of that information, reading of light, has to be incredibly processed. To be just to walk, just not to fall over, just to know it's a flower and not anything else. So there's this immense categorization that's happening on a very primitive level. Slime molds do it. The fact that a slime mold can remember and learn means it's doing it. And let alone before you get neurons and the whole structure that will become the brain. So you're getting a biological system which is categorizing everything and allowing you to process this on a biological level. And then it looks like to me that process whereby we've been able to focus on what matters means we can focus on our own processing. And then we make conscious the processing. And it has the same advantage of making conscious the sensing, which is it enables us to do what matters most better. We can learn better. We can imagine the future better. We can see how we're processing and change it. We can read our passivity and change it. And that's what's been evolving. And once we developed symbolic language, that gave us a vocabulary, because most of the way we do it, not everyone does it, some people do it very visually, but most people do it by imagining talking to themselves. And that's what thinking is. This is what we're doing together now. You're just doing it to yourself in your imagination. So that's creating this imaginal realm. Now, for me, therefore, it's like, and then the culture bit is like, well, there's lots of us. So the collective interaction is going to give us culture.
Yeah.
But the thing which has happened is that a new level of information has opened up, which is imaginal in quality. And so all of what we've been able to do then is make conscious some of the ways in which we process things previously on the lower level. It's quite hard to do. And then once we've got language, it's exponential, isn't it? Because you've got ideas about ideas about ideas about ideas.
Yeah.
And the categorization means we can talk about philosophy and the origins of the universe.
Well, I guess one way of asking the question would be, it seems like all information requires a substrate. It seems like when you use
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah. So I'll throw this out, then tell me what you think about, or how you think differently about this. I tend to think of information as being, we're kind of using an abstraction, which is like information is really pattern. It's an abstraction recognizing that, Gregory Bateson talked about differences that make a difference, but differences have to be showing up relative to other stuff. And then it's sort of like, well, what are they? So like you can see, in the Utah case, right, that like that life is processing, you could say, genetic information. So that's sort of the substrate. And then my mind is doing this thing with electricity through my nervous system and that. And then with language, that's the information. And so it seems like there needs to be some sort of conveyance, some medium for the information for it to be real. And that's, I think, maybe where my hang up is. So if we're positing this imaginal realm, what is its medium? But maybe I'm misframing the problem. So how do you see it?
No, I think you're hitting it dead on. I think you're absolutely hitting it dead on, Brendan. But what I want to suggest is that what physics has shown us over the last few decades now is that information, we think of information like in computers. You take the information, you put it in something. But what I think physics has shown us is that it's not matter which you put information in, which is the primary concept that we need. It's information, that the universe is information. And what I mean by information isn't just like in information theory where it's like a difference that makes a difference. I just mean difference. And that, so duality, the one in relationship to itself, is the primary bit of information. So the one is also two. And then from that is going to come all information. There's no substrate. And we see that, we're talking about physics, light. There's no substrate. A waveform is a mathematical entity. There's no substrate. It's a mathematical entity. That's what happens. As you go down deeper and deeper and deeper, you see, the one, which is the undifferentiated, which is also in itself nothing, is differentiated as information. And that is that, and every bit of information is relational. Time is relational, space is relational, what will become subject object is relational, energy is relational, causality is relational, everything is. So that fundamental relationality, which is the one as two, the bit, information, will become everything. And then that information is what the infoverse is made of. That's what I'm speculating, that we can't understand. One of the big problems for science, a huge problem, so big that only now are a handful of physicists beginning to talk about it, is if everything is being run by laws of nature. The whole idea of a law is crazy, isn't it? Like, because we don't believe in lawgivers anymore. We don't think there was a God who went, let there be gravity. So once you get rid of the law, it's not a law, is it? So it's a regularity, let's say. Where is it? Where's E equals MC squared? If it's a material universe, where the fuck is it? And it's nowhere. What I'm positing is, look, it's not like there's laws and then everything else is a byproduct. It's that the universe is learning. And there was a fantastic paper brought out by Lee Smolin and 12 other physicists while I was working on my current work a few years ago, now a couple of years maybe, called The Autodidactic Universe.
Yes, I read it. It's very good. Yeah.
Yes, that's the idea.
Yeah.
That's the idea that I was trying to play with in Substrate. It's not the intelligent design, it's the evolution of intelligence. It's not a created universe, it's the evolution of creativity. And where is all of that? Well, it is what I mean by the infoverse. So if you imagine the past is accumulating and getting richer and richer, and that's where all the information is. That's the differentiation. It's not stuck somehow in some substrate which is existing now.
Yeah.
Some of it is, of course. It can be.
So here's a question then. So let me see if I can put this idea into words. Okay, rather than, because my architectural thinking of this issue was matter, life, mind, culture, and then at culture we get symbolic language, and then we're able to have the symbolic and the imaginal, and then so it would seem like if there is this God, the love light and all that it somehow needs to be predicated upon the substrate of culture, which is predicated. And so that's why the whole death thing becomes this big issue, because if you knock out the biological substrate, doesn't the whole thing come crashing down? But it might seem like you're sort of positing almost a kind of orthogonal, if that's the right way of putting it, that like, yes, there is this complexity stack and there is symbolic mediated culture, but that's really just providing us an information processing system by means, as you say, to be able to become aware of all these dynamics and use language to talk about them. But it's not like, if this makes sense, like, it's not like that's then where the imaginal fully stems from. It's like we're just able to use that new level of complex information processing to then, in a sense, look at everything that already exists and then be like, oh, there that is, and now we can talk about that using language. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's one way I'm trying to frame this. Yeah.
So no, I think Brendan, let me come back on that, and then you come back on.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
To see whether we're because I really would like us to find a way at least of understanding what we're saying here, because it seems really good. So here was the problem for me. For me, it was mainly through Ken Wilber, amazing thinker, obviously, hugely influential, was I had to drop the idea that everything was that all emergence was kind of holonic.
Uh-huh.
And go, no, don't think, some things are things made of bigger things, but evolution happens, which is not holonic. I mean, modernity evolved from the Middle Ages, but it doesn't contain lots of Middle Ages.
Right. Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I evolved from fish, but I'm not full of little fish.
Right.
That's not the way things happen. Some things happen like that. That's one of the things that can happen. I call it unividuating. It's, a bigger whole is made. I think it happened with my body. I think it's happening with psyches and God, but I don't think it's happening with everything. Most of it. But here is what's happening with everything, which is not holonic emergence, but temporal emergence. Because I'm going, look, the past hasn't gone anywhere. So it's still predicated on biology. It's just not the biology of the body now.
Yeah.
It couldn't, emergence for me means you couldn't have this until you got that. So you couldn't have psyche until you had the body.
Yeah.
But you had the body.
Yeah.
Now there's the psyche. Well, if the psyche continues, it's not somehow cut off or disappeared. It's a continuation of the same thing which had the body. And it was that which enabled this next level. So more like modernity arriving from the Middle Ages. It's more like, and it just jumps to another level.
Well, and I will say, I think I totally agree with that. And that's also been a hang up I've had with some of the integral framings of things. And when you actually study developmental processes, it's much more that than it is this, like transcend and include is a very important idea, but that, as you say, doesn't mean that, I include all of the previous evolutionary levels that existed. So,
but what you can do is take that phrase, because I do love that phrase.
Sure.
And I'm very grateful to Ken for it. But if you take it temporally, that's exactly what happens.
Yes. Yeah.
Like this moment has transcended, in a sense, and included the moment that came before it.
Yeah.
Every moment does.
Yeah.
So that every new forming contains within it everything that's formed.
Well, so here's I'm going to ask I'm going to circumambulate around this thing that I'm trying to ask, which I can't ask directly, but I'll ask a couple different questions that's sort of getting at what needs clarity for me. We'll try a few of these. So, if this one doesn't land, we'll try another.
Good for you.
Does the love light, let's say, the God, in this imaginos, did that exist 500 million years ago, or did that come into being with the emergence of human psyches?
No, I think it is the next level from the psyche.
Great. Okay. So that's helpful. Okay. So then, and I want to come back. It's a reformulation of that substrate thing. It's sort of like, where is it? Meaning, obviously, not in just simple spatial, extension, but like, because you one of the fascinating things about this whole presentation is this connection to dreaming, and how that you make a really interesting connection with the dream state and where this is sort of going on, in a sense, right? Yeah. And so I'm looking for that to land more intuitively for me, because there's a lot of ideas that are sort of like, oh, that's very compelling, but then it does seem that, right, like when I dream, it does seem to it seems like the body is doing an important aspect for the dreaming to happen. But again, maybe that's some smuggled in objectivist reductionist metaphysics. I don't know. So then it seems like, well, then if I die, then how can the dream go on? Where is that happening? So that maybe be the second question.
Yeah. So I think the answer is the same one that I gave earlier, but I'll try and say it better. Which is I suspect, and this is not my work, this is other people's work, but I suspect that the psyche evolved to begin with as dreaming, and that's where it starts. And you can even go back as far as maybe arguably octopuses who seem to dream, and that's a long way back. So that what seems to be happening is better processing of memory and better processing of danger and how to avoid it, which is why we still get lots of dreams which are scary. Mm-hmm. And that's still continued. Now that is happening on a biological level, and it's giving rise to something which is no longer on a biological level, just beginning, and the two are linked. Obviously, the psyche and the body are really linked. You give me a sleeping pill, I'm going to go to sleep. You give me a psychedelic, I'm going to, top of my head will come off. The two are linked. That right now it's like this. The question is, are they intrinsically linked? Or when my one hand goes, oh, Does this hand goes, oh, I'm fine. That's the question. And what I'm exploring is that when we dream, we are still alive. You're in bed. If someone comes in the door and shouts, you'll wake up. You're taking in all information unconsciously, which is why when the alarm clock goes off, you wake up. But you're also, your attention is in the dream state, and it can be all sorts of dreams, can't it? But some of them are very vivid and incredibly real. Same with meditation. A lot of spiritual practice, a lot of the shamanic practices and all the esoteric practices that came from them, and the meditative practices have been about cultivating states where you can put your attention so directly in that imaginal realm, the imaginos as I called it, that it becomes incredibly vivid. Now, but you're still with the body. Now, when the body is not functioning at all, it looks like, from what people describe, that it becomes incredibly vivid. And what I'm suggesting is that just like here, everything that's been is still the same in the imaginal. There's a whole soulscapes being created where we're meeting. And that is so that a lot of the spiritual practices is about learning to be able to perceive those, and that looks like what we experience after death. And what I'm really saying here is not that different. I mean, the mechanism is very different, but the some of it's not that different to, say, Tibetan Buddhism, with the idea of the bardos, and that imaginal experience can continue.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think that this is. I get this profound intuition that there's something, again, that there's really something here. If we are going to meaningfully integrate these things, I think that they demand, some work needs to be done in this sort of direction to make them conceptually coherent and to bring things together. And so I think that this is, I feel like it's like a growth edge for me. Like I feel like this is there. I've had these hangups that need, I don't know, some kind of resolution, and I feel like this is a potential way that could occur. But I'm really, I need to kind of digest that in a way, and it needs to sort of land in a kind of deep, intuitive way. I feel like before it's got to click. And so I'm trying to find ways of making that click, and some of that's going to be some kind of a paradigm shift. I know, because if it has to do with this whole way of things, in a sense, transcending their earlier substrates. Yeah.
Yes, and I wrestled with everything that you're wrestling with, and have ended up where I am, and I could of course be completely wrong. And the reason I've wrestled with them for all these years and invest the most extraordinary amount of energy in that process, day after day, really, Brendan, as is because for exactly the reason you just said. It just feels like, look, this matters. Because if there's a way we haven't seen yet, which allows us to go, it's not woo-woo to think that the soul survives the death of the body. It's actually completely reasonable, and you can have a solid intellectual grasp of things. And that is hugely important. People often, it always makes me laugh, really, because one of the reactions I get is like, well, I'm not so worried about living forever like you, and as if it doesn't matter. The thing which really motivates me with it is that, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, in that deep awake state that I first tasted when I was 12, and I've been exploring ever since, there is something so optimistic, something so full of hope, something which redeems the suffering. So the question for me is, how can that be true? Or is it just, am I slightly bipolar and that's just too much, then off I go. Is it that? Doesn't feel like that to me, but hey, I could be deluded. That's definitely possible, but it doesn't feel like that. So if it's not, how could that be? And that matters. It matters not just for me, who's had a great life, but it matters for the child who's lived till 3 in intense pain every day and then died. Because if I can't turn around to that child and go, it's still redeemable, and the only way I can see that is redeemable is through the survival of the soul. So if it is redeemable, and my feeling is it is, then there is a way we need to understand the survival of the soul. And the key to it is to change, I don't know if this will help, but I think it's about identity. It's going, you are a process in time, Everything you've ever been is the foundation for the next experience, the next moment of what you are. You're not a physical thing. You're the system organizing matter on the biological level.
Hmm.
And on the psyche level, you're a system which is, so here you are, everything you experience is the biology is held together, and then you experience the world through it,
Mm-hmm.
with it, as
Yeah.
it, let's call it, as it. And you also are not a psi sensing the imaginal realm. And that's another sense. And just as if you put out my eyes, I would continue to hear. And if I put out my ears, I would continue to taste. And if you put out my whole body, I continue to sigh. I can still psi sense the imaginal realm. That is able to continue and actually become more and more intense. Just like if you put out my eyes, my ears would start to become really vivid.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the problem of suffering is a really interesting aspect to this, because I do totally agree. I mean, certainly agree that earlier theological accounts do not do justice to that question. And so for me, which may only be kind of a half turn, finding evolutionary spirituality was very crucial for that issue, because it's sort of like, yeah, maybe things didn't begin with an all-powerful, all-loving God, but maybe they're headed there. And once you do that, it doesn't redeem the suffering, but it does allow some explanation for, how that could occur in a way that traditional theological lenses don't.
Absolutely.
But that being said, there might be even this other step that could be made of somehow folding that back in a way that is ultimately redeemable. And
I think it's those two things, Brendan.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to capture that because you hit it. For me, it's like the two things which we've lost, which are most important, if they are real, is what you just said. Not a big loving God at the beginning. That guy's a mad monster. Look at the world. But is it possible, like you said, that's arising as an emergent level, and that is why the process we're in is so amazing. And that gives a general sense to it. And then there's the specific, which is that child, in my example. And that's where the survival of the soul, I think, those two together were the center of the best of traditional Western spirituality.
Yeah.
And they need to come back, but they need to come back in a completely different form.
Yeah. Well, and again, and we can start to unfortunately move this to a close, because this is fascinating stuff. But we've already covered a lot of ground, but I also want to be mindful of your time and whatnot. But just a few things. It's like, when I was reading the last section of this book, and you're describing the love light and some people's near-death experiences of that, and sort of the moving between of, through this reincarnation process, all this stuff, there's a way in which all that deeply intuitively, and also just from so much of my experience and things I've read, and across all the literature, whether it's Jung or Dante or all these things, there's like so many images there that just somehow that lands it, like, oh yeah, there's something really to that. And then you bring in, psychedelic experiences. There's so much, there's a profound suggestivity about all of this plethora of information coming from so many different angles, that in studying the religious traditions, like there's something there. And then when I see the prospect of then being able potentially to plug that into an emergentist framework that sees that also then is profoundly consonant with my conception of the sacred, which is that thing that calls us up to these higher emergent levels, that's always sort of operating. And then when we feel that awe, that wonder, that sort of flow state, it is a learning process, and it is sort of leveling us up and all this stuff. It all fits together. But it was funny, because when I was reading this book and I got to that pivot point, it was such a kind of microcosm of my own hang up around how to bring those two things together. How do we bring in all the emergentism and complexity science, all that deep information theory and thermodynamic stuff, even all that, and then sync that up with this rich, religious, spiritual, mystical tradition. And that to me is like where some maybe the most important work needs to be done, is how of making that work. I think some of the great stuff about Integral is that it has tried to do things like that, or you could even say meta theory, or maybe meta theoretical religious metaphysics or post metaphysics in some ways, are all kind of hanging out in that space. And we need different approaches to these questions, because some things are going to add really important stuff to the mix, but other things are going to miss. And so we just need more of that variation that we can then draw from. But anyway, so I was just kind of autobiographically naming that. And also there's a real their need to make those connections deeper. So anyway, that's just a brief reflection. Yeah, there's so many angles, there's so many directions we could go in. Is there anything just for the time being you would want to throw into this conversation at this point, certainly before we close anything up?
I think there's three little tiny things, just personal things. One is it's been a delight to talk with somebody who I can resonate like this, and who is clearly exploring the same terrain and realizes what we need to find. And this is, I'm doing my best to make my contribution as you are, and between us, maybe something can emerge. I ended my TED talk with this idea, which I thought was a new understanding is coming, and it's going to change everything. And my feeling is, look, that's not controversial. Of course, the new government, it's like it always has. The question is when and what is it? And I think those of us who are following this are looking for that new understanding, which is on the same level of transformation. I mean, just can you imagine if suddenly those spiritual experiences, which have been so important to people, but which have to be dismissed if we leave behind mythic thinking, which we should, apart from, as story where it's wonderful, but in terms of like really understanding the nature of the universe, if we leave that behind, we need to replace it with something which can make sense of all of this. So it's great to have that conversation. I also wanted to say, because you brought it up, and my wife always tells me to remember, and I always forget, that part of what I do is to take people to the experience I call unividuality, which is being an individual conscious of oneness, which experience of God is what you'd call it in the old days. And I'm doing that in the UK in September, one time this year. So if anyone's intrigued to know what the experience is, and that's the big thing. It's like, if you've had the experience of that enormous love, if you've just gone, whoa, if you've had that, you can't miss it. Then then it becomes like, well, that's real. Now, how can that be real? And how can we make sense of that best? And that's what I'm doing the best to do.
Yeah. Wow. Can you say just briefly a little bit more about that? When is it? And I mean, I'm always intrigued by the idea of like, yeah, we can do workshops or even meditation retreats and things like that, where you can maybe create the conditions in which an experience like that could happen. But like, do you feel like in your experience of leading these things, like there's a sense of, yeah, we've gotten pretty good about being able to help facilitate people have this experience pretty readily? Like, say more about that.
I'd say nearly everyone.
Wow.
I want to say everyone, but that just sounds outrageous. And it's been like that for a while. Yeah, there's a magic formula. Well, there is. What I have been exploring is how to enter a state of communion, whereby as an individual, you commune with, it's not union because you're still there, but you are the one in relationship with the one. And how that fundamentally shifts your experience of what it is to be alive. And that when you come into that communion, you come into God. And 20 years ago, I started doing something which now, I mean, I didn't invent it, for goodness sake, and people are doing it more and more all the time. But I found a lovely way of doing it, which is we lead up to an experience whereby you commune with each other. So it's not me. I haven't got a magic wand or anything like that. People do it to each other. And what happens is when we gather together on a Saturday night, we'll create an enchanting environment because beauty does wonders. We'll have beautiful music because music is magic. And you will get to commune with one person and it'll blow your mind. And then another one and it'll blow your mind. And by the time you've done that for, let's say, an hour, you are in that state. And it's because it's a natural thing for us now. It may not have been in the past. Maybe you had got mountains. I don't know. Probably. But now you connect. It's the psi sensing. It's you start. It's like when I look at you now, I can see, well, I'm looking at pixels on the screen for one thing, but what I'm seeing is your lovely face and your smile and your eyes, and it's like beautiful. And then what I'm connecting with, I can't see. It's
Hmm.
imaginal. I'm connecting with your psyche, and I can sense your psyche.
Hmm.
I'm doing it right now. And but because what you focus on becomes vivid, if I stop the talking and we just sense each other's psyche,
Hmm.
suddenly we're like that,
That's interesting.
and we start to commune, and that's when this emergent state, which are the
Yeah.
communion of souls, the God.
It's almost like meditating on the psyche, if that makes sense, right? Like,
That's exactly it,
yeah.
Brendan. You've just named it. That's it.
I
You're
love it.
meditating on, soul to soul. You're connecting directly. And what I love about it is that actually you're doing it all the time. You're listening. You can do it with listening. You can do it with touch. You can do it with eyes. And that becomes a focus for actually sensing. You're putting your attention on it, on the other person, the other psyche or soul. And when you do that, it becomes vivid. And as you learn to do that, it's a utterly beautiful thing.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I will. I guess I'll put a link maybe to. Would that be on your website somewhere if people are
Yes,
interested?
it is. It's September the 13th, and it's in my hometown in Glastonbury in the UK. And it'll be a small one.
Yeah.
Because it really works well. I like them to be. I like it to be of a size where I can meet everyone, be with everyone, and we can relax. All of that craziness that people have seen me on the screen, and then suddenly it's just me.
Yeah.
And we can be with each other in a very authentic way, and not any of those spiritual games.
Yeah.
And then it just happens, really. And hopefully that is something which can be a life transforming. Take people in their own soul journey on their evolution.
Well, gosh, if you ever wanted to do one of these in the States, let me know. I run a retreat center here in Vermont, and we do, yeah.
Brendan, I do want to do one. I've done many in the States, but not since COVID. And I've got people in the States who are trying to work out bringing me to the States next year.
Oh, cool.
So that would definitely be possible.
Yeah, we can connect on that. That sounds like amazing sorts of things, just the kind of thing we would be wanting to do here. So anyway, well, gosh, so there's all that. There's all your other works, and then I would also just again throw this one up on the screen and encourage people to check this out, and to stay tuned to the stuff that you're doing now, which is carrying this forward and developing these ideas into new domains, and to continue evolving. And I think that there's something profoundly admirable about that, rather than just sort of sitting with, oh, I have a cool thing that people like, and so I'll do more of that. You're really still exploring that zone of proximal development yourself, and trying to expand into new territory. And so I think that that's a very exciting and wonderful thing. So we look forward to what else comes from you, but also would love to have more conversations with you in the future as well, because I feel like, again, we just scratched the surface here. So there's a lot of other directions we could go in with all this. And
I would love that too, Brendan.
Yeah.
It's been an absolute delight.
Cool. Tim Freke, thank you so much. Godspeed. Appreciate it.